In which modern country was the heartland of Mesopotamian civilization located? Iraq. Who was the representative female pharaoh of ancient Egypt? Hatshepsut. What were the main economic activities of the Indus civilization? Agriculture and trade. For what purpose were the seals found at Indus civilization sites used? As commercial seals. What is thought to have been the cause of the decline of the Indus civilization? Environmental changes and external invasions. In which modern country are most of the ancient cities found at Indus civilization sites located? Pakistan. What are the two representative cities of the Indus civilization? Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. The Sphinx is a figure that combines what with what? A human face and a lion's body. What objects symbolized the authority of the pharaoh? The crown, scepter, and staff. What were the main raw materials used to make paper invented during the Han dynasty? Plant fibers and recycled waste materials. What script system was used before Emperor Qin Shi Huang standardized the characters? Dajong, large seal script. What was the first farming tool used in the Yellow River civilization? Wooden hoe. In the Code of Hammurabi, which subject occupies the largest portion of its contents? Commercial law. Which king built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar II. What did the Babylonians regard as their principal protective deity? Marduk. Which king led the territorial expansion of Babylon and laid the foundations of its empire? King Hammurabi. Why did astrology develop so greatly in Babylonia? To predict the future. What items were used for transactions in Babylonia? Grain, silver, and animals. Who was the highest god worshipped by the Assyrians? The god Ashur. What kind of road network did Assyria build to move troops and supplies quickly? A military road network. By which powers was the Assyrian Empire destroyed? A coalition of Neo-Babylonia and Media. The iconic Temple of Ashur in Assyria was dedicated to which deity? The god Ashur. What impact did Assyria have on the cultures of the regions it ruled? Integration and blending of the cultures of conquered lands. Which people with Iron Age technology destroyed the Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization? The Dorians. What is thought to be the main reason why Minoan buildings withstood natural disasters? Earthquake-resistant construction. What religious symbol was commonly found in the temples and palaces of the ancient Minoan civilization? The double axe, labris. What script, found in the palaces of the Mycenaean civilization, recorded the administrative and economic activities of its kings? Linear B. What construction technique, used in the Mycenaean civilization, built fortification walls by stacking massive stones? Cyclopean architecture. In ancient Athens, what was the hill on which the major temples were concentrated? The Acropolis. In ancient Greece, what were the heavily armed infantrymen who went into battle called? Hoplites. Which architectural order in ancient Greek architecture is characterized by a simple yet imposing style? The Doric order. In ancient Sparta, what concept emphasized respect for the elderly and their role in society? Garicea. What was the name of the ship that Jason and the heroes sailed on to find the Golden Fleece? Argonaut. What wooden war engine did the Greek army use to secure victory in the Trojan War? The Trojan horse. Which philosopher considered air to be the fundamental principle of all things? Anaximenes. Which philosopher argued that being is one and unchanging? Parmenides. Which philosopher declared that man is the measure of all things? Protagoras. Which philosopher claimed that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger? Thrasymachus. What is the method by which Socrates drew out truth through dialogue? The Maieutic method. What key concept did Aristotle emphasize in his Ethics as the proper balance between extremes? The doctrine of the mean. What is the name of the philosophical movement that seeks true knowledge through reason? Rationalism. What was the popular court in Athens where citizens served as jurors? The People's Court. What was the council in Athens that deliberated on laws and policy? The Bouli, the Council of 500. In ancient Athens, what was the citizen army that participated in the defense of the state? The citizen militia. What was the system in Athens by which the territory was divided into administrative units and governed regionally? An administrative district system. What was the battle in which Sparta was defeated by Thebes and consequently declined? Leuctruan battle. Who was the strategist that led the Greek navy at the Battle of Salamis? Themistocles. Why was the Spartan army so strong? Harsh training from a young age. From where did Xerxes I watch the battle during the Battle of Salamis? From the hill opposite Salamis. At the Battle of Thermopylae, where did the Spartan army fight to the very end? The Hill of the Lion. Who was the leader that commanded the Athenian army in the Sicilian expedition? Alcibiades. What was the cause of the assassination of Xerxes I during his reign? A court revolt. What was the title of the officials who were in charge of collecting taxes in the Persian Empire? Satraps. Which key goods did Carthage trade to achieve economic prosperity? Gold, silver, and purple dye. What form of government did Carthage have? A republic. What was the battle in which Hannibal won his greatest victory? The Battle of Cannae. What do we call the civilizations that developed in ancient Western Asia and Egypt? The Orient. In ancient Sparta, what kind of environment was created in order to raise children to be tough? They were subjected to harsh conditions such as coarse food and austere living. In Zoroastrianism, what is the name of the supreme god who symbolizes goodness and truth? Ahura Mazda. In Zoroastrianism, what is the place of worship at the center of faith, where the sacred fire burns continuously? The Fire Temple. On what political principles was the rule of Cyrus II based? A policy of tolerance and religious freedom. On what year and date did Alexander the Great die? June 10, year 323 BC. What important Persian traditional festival was held annually at Persepolis? Nowruz, the Persian New Year festival. Which Macedonian king influenced Alexander the Great from his childhood? Philip II. Which Greek city revolted against Macedon after Alexander the Great came to the throne? Thebes. What is the name of the succession wars fought by the generals of Alexander the Great after his death? The Diadochi Wars. What were the main regions where Hellenistic culture spread? Greece, Egypt, Persia, and Western India. Which religion was most strongly influenced by both Hellenism and Hebraism? Christianity. Why did Carthage grow into the most powerful maritime empire? Because of its strong navy and extensive trade network. What was the representative warship used by the Carthaginian navy in battle? Quinquirem. What form of government did Carthage have? Republic. What were the main types of troops in the Carthaginian army led by Hannibal? Mercenaries and cavalry. What was the main religious system in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II's rule? Polytheism centered on Marduk. How many layers did the walls of Babylon consist of? 2 to 3 layers. Which corps unit of the Carthaginian army was used to attack the enemy's flanks? Cavalry. Up until the Battle of Leuctra, which polis was the most powerful military state in Greece? Sparta. What were the main siege weapons used in the Persian Wars? Siege towers and catapults. To what did Socrates compare himself when speaking to the citizens? He was compared to a lamp. For what purpose did Plato found the academy? To study philosophy and the governance of the state. What concept did Aristoteles propose when criticizing Plato's theory of forms? Form and matter. What was the name of the edict by which Emperor Constantinus legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire? The Edict of Milano. What were the most famous venues in Rome where gladiatorial games and chariot races were held? The Colosseum and the Circus Maximus. What was the gold coin of the Roman era that was mainly used by the upper class and for large transactions? Aureus. What defensive formation did the Roman army create by combining their shields to block enemy arrows? The tortoise formation. What was the minimum number of years soldiers were required to serve in the Roman army? About 25 years or more. From the reign of which emperor is the late Roman Empire generally considered to have begun? Diocletian. What was the name of the decree by which Theodosius I declared Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire? The Edict of Thessalonica. In the late Roman Empire, what concept led to the emperor being worshipped like a god to strengthen imperial authority? The cult of the emperor. In what year did the Roman kingdom end and the Republic begin? Year 509 BCE. What was one of the most important wars fought in the early Roman Empire to expand its territory? The Dacian Wars of Conquest. In the Roman Republic, what was the strongest power held by the tribunes? The veto power. Who was the founder of the Seleucid dynasty? Seleucus I Nicator. Which city served as the important capital of the Seleucid dynasty? Antiochia. From which famous conqueror's successor did the Ptolemaic dynasty originate? Alexander the Great. Who was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the queen deeply entangled with Rome? Cleopatra VII. What decisive battle turned the Ptolemaic dynasty into a client state of Rome? Actium battle. What famous phrase did Caesar utter when he crossed the river Rubicon? The die is cast. In times of political crisis, whom did Caesar often claim to emulate? Alexander the Great. Which of the Germanic kingdoms became the origin of France and Germany? Frankish Kingdom. What was the economic center owned by a feudal lord called? The manor. What change marked the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? The appearance of machines. What was a major change in transportation brought about by the Industrial Revolution? The advent of the railway. Why did women's and children's labor increase during the Industrial Revolution? Because they were hired for low wages. In what year did World War I end? Year 1918. In the Sarajevo incident that triggered World War I, which person was assassinated? Franz Ferdinand Archduke. What philosophical method did Socrates emphasize? Dialogue and self-examination. To which fields of knowledge did Aristotle make contributions? Philosophy and the natural sciences. What kind of thought did Confucius advocate? Confucianism. What did Mengzi claim about human nature? That it is fundamentally good. What did the kings of the Zhou dynasty emphasize to maintain their power? Rule by virtue. Why did Louis XIV say, "I am the state"? To emphasize his absolute royal authority. What approach did Persian kings use in governing many different peoples? A policy of tolerance. In what ways did serfs differ from free peasants? Their movement and marriage were restricted. What urban change was one of the backgrounds for the development of the Renaissance? The growth of commerce. What was a major reason that Florence became a center of the Renaissance? Its wealthy citizens and patronage of the arts. What led colonial soldiers to participate in World War I? Promises of independence and conscription. Why did Han Fizi think that law was so important? Because he believed people are inherently self-interested. In Plato's ideal state, who formed the lowest class? The producer class. Which institution did Caroline of the Frankish kingdom particularly emphasize? The strengthening of royal authority in conjunction with Christianity. In year 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Which country dropped these bombs? The United States. By observing the sky, which field of study developed in Mesopotamian civilization? Astronomy. As medieval towns grew, what impact did they have on the feudal system? They weakened it. Which king, renowned for chivalry and honor, ruled England? Richard I, known as the Lionheart. Why did scientists of the Renaissance era begin to follow a path different from religion? Because they placed greater importance on observation and experimentation. Why did the Industrial Revolution spread across the world? Because technology and capital spread globally. What was the purpose of Louis XIV in building the Palace of Versailles? To display his power and control the nobility. Why did ancient kings divide their realms into administrative districts? To govern more efficiently. The capital of the Byzantium Empire was a natural fortress surrounded by the sea on 3 sides. What city was this? Constantinople. Why do Muslims pray facing Mecca? Because it is their holy city. What is the vast temple complex found in Cambodia? Angkor Wat. Which medieval port city is famous for marzipan and its role in the Hanseatic League? Lubeck. What was the early Frankish dynasty that allied with the Catholic Church to expand its influence in Europe? The Merovingian dynasty. In the Frankish kingdom, who was the son of Karl Martel that became king and formed an alliance with the Pope? Pepin III. In ancient Egypt, what term was used to refer to the king? Pharaoh. Who drafted the United States Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson. Who was the leader of the nonviolent resistance movement that led India's independence struggle? Mahatma Gandhi. What is the official currency of the European Union? The euro. Which Greek philosopher left the famous saying, "Know thyself"? Socrates. Which major poet of China's Tang dynasty is often mentioned alongside Li Bai? Tu Po. After the Reformation, what was the name of the new church established in England with the monarch as its supreme head? The Church of England. In which battle did Napoleon suffer his final defeat? Waterloo Battle. In ancient Egypt, what embalming technique was used to create mummies of royalty and nobility? Mummy-making technique. Where did Gautama Siddhartha, who attained enlightenment and became the Buddha, first preach in Buddhism? Sarnath. During the British Industrial Revolution, what was the movement in which workers protested harsh working conditions and low wages by destroying machinery? The Luddite movement. After the Crusades, which social group in Europe grew as interest in Eastern cultures and goods increased? The merchant class. Which principality in the Russian lands, once under Mongol rule, freed itself from Mongol influence and established a unified state? The Grand Duchy of Moscow. During the American War of Independence, what were the mainly German soldiers who served as mercenaries for the British Army called? Hessian mercenaries. During World War II, which major port city did Japan occupy after the attack on Pearl Harbor? Hong Kong. Which Mongol leader built a vast empire across the Eurasian continent in the 13th century? Genghis Khan. Which king led the heyday of French absolute monarchy, often summed up by the phrase, "I am the state"? Louis XIV. After World War II, what was the system of confrontation between two blocs led by the United States and the Soviet Union called? The Cold War. What do we call the phenomenon of deepening interdependence among countries after the Cold War? Globalization. Which emperor led the Byzantine Empire at its height and compiled a great law code? Justinian I. Which ancient empire in Mexico was destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors? Aztec Empire. What was the pictographic script used in ancient Egypt? Hieroglyphs. Which shogunate ruled Japan for about 260 years from the early 17th century and pursued a policy of national isolation? The Tokugawa shogunate. What was the movement in 19th century America that called for the abolition of slavery? The abolitionist movement. What policy did the United States implement to overcome the Great Depression? The New Deal policy. What epidemic drastically reduced the population of Europe in the 14th century? The Black Death. What was the policy by which Britain and France accepted Germany's demands just before the outbreak of World War II? The policy of appeasement. What was the wave of pro-democracy protests that began in Tunisia at the end of 2010 and spread across the Arab world called? The Arab Spring. What was the code of law that systematized ancient Roman law and greatly influenced later legal systems? The Corpus Juris Civilis. What is the name of the 1077 incident in which the Holy Roman Emperor sought the lifting of his excommunication and submitted to the Pope outside snow-covered Canossa Castle? The humiliation of Canossa. What was the first East Slavic state that became the origin of medieval Russia? Kiev Rus. After the end of World War I, which pandemic spread worldwide and caused many deaths? The Spanish flu. What was the pact concluded just before World War II in which Germany and the Soviet Union agreed on mutual non-aggression and the division of Poland? The Non-Aggression Treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union. What was the operation in which the United States and Western countries airlifted supplies in response to the Soviet blockade of Berlin? Berlin Airlift. Which German theologian initiated the Protestant Reformation in 16th century Europe? Martin Luther. Which absolute monarch of France is known for the phrase, "I am the state"? Louis XIV. Which Austrian diplomat helped restore the European order through the Congress of Vienna? Clemens von Metternich. What was the prison that became the symbolic site of the outbreak of the French Revolution? Bastille Prison. What was the peace treaty concluded between the victorious powers of World War I and Germany? Treaty of Versailles. Who was the notable figure appointed as dictator in times of crisis in Rome? Cincinnatus. What was the policy Britain pursued to link a north-south railway line across Africa? Cape de Cairo policy. Where was the Soviet nuclear power plant that suffered a catastrophic explosion in 1986? Chernobyl. On which peninsula, corresponding to a region of the present-day world, did the Maya civilization flourish? Yucatan Peninsula. Which modern city stands where the capital of the Aztec civilization once stood? Mexico City. What was the 1894 peasant uprising in Korea that directly triggered the First Sino-Japanese War? The Donghek Peasant Uprising. Which country, declared independent in 2002, became the first new state of the 21st century? Timor-Leste. What was the 1962 incident that brought the Soviet Union and the United States to the brink of nuclear war? The Cuba Missile Crisis. Which 1942 naval battle turned the tide of the Pacific War? The Midway Battle. What was the name of the armed organization that launched the Algerian independence struggle in 1954? FLN. What were books written by hand before the invention of printing in Europe called? Manuscripts. Which Enlightenment thinker wrote The Spirit of the Laws and advocated the separation of powers? Montesquieu. What do we call the 1077 event in which the emperor sought forgiveness from the Pope? The Connaught humiliation. What was the name of the new Low Countries state that declared independence in 1581? The Dutch Republic. What term is used to describe the global economic collapse of 1929? The Great Depression. What is the name of the Moroccan institution known as the oldest university in the world? Al-Qarawiyyin. Who was the leader who spearheaded China's reforms and helped establish diplomatic relations with the United States in 1979? Deng Xiaoping. What is the name of the space agency that the United States created after the Soviet launch of Sputnik? NASA. Which 1781 battle in Virginia confirmed the final victory of the American Revolutionary War? The Yorktown Battle. In the Greco-Persian Wars, which naval battle did Athens win? The Salamis Battle. In what year was the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen adopted? Year 1789. What was the name of the treaty concluded in 1840 between the Maori people of New Zealand and Britain? The Waitangi Treaty. What was the decisive battle that led to Napoleon's downfall? The Waterloo Battle. What was the name of the ancient major trade route that connected East and West? Silk Road. Which British thinker wrote The Wealth of Nations and became known as the father of classical economics? Adam Smith. Which country did Iraq invade in 1990, starting the Gulf War? Kuwait. What was the name of the American fleet that appeared in Edo Bay in 1853 to demand the opening of Japan? Perry Fleet. What is the name given to the modernization reforms of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century? Tanzimat. Thank you for watching until the end. We'd love to hear your feedback and historical insights in the comments. Your support helps us create even more history quizzes. Let's keep exploring together.